This program is brought to you by Brickworks. We believe in making beautiful products that last forever.
For more than 100 years, Australia and the United States have fought side by side as allies, building a relationship we've come to know as the Alliance. In this series, we'll bring you the complete story of our Pacific partnership.
We'll explore the cultural, economic and military ties that bring Canberra closer to Washington and the historic links at the heart of our two democracies.
This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Anzac Treaty, and for many in the Pacific region, it's never been more important.
This isn't just a dusty piece of paper that we get out and we celebrate whenever the number is round enough for us. This is an active and alive relationship that every day in Canberra and every day in Washington, D.C., our senior leaders wake up and they continue to walk forward and develop this alliance. So it's an active, living thing.
In episode 1, we'll look back at how our shared sacrifice in both World War I and World War II helped establish our bond, and look at what lessons we can take from past conflicts to prevent the same catastrophic consequences happening again.
I think the biggest danger in the world at the moment is a superpower competition spiralling out of control.
That's all to come on The Alliance. Anzac Day, Washington, D.C. The impact of COVID-19 meant it was a leaner dawn service at the Australian residence this year. A long way from home and supported by our mates in Washington, the ceremony went ahead to honour our servicemen and women.
In Australia, this day is often described as the one day of the year. The story of Anzac has reverberated through the years to become our most important national commemoration. A commemoration forged on a foreign battlefield only a few years into the birth of a new nation.
Australia was so young in 1914, the flag we use today had only existed for 6 years prior to the outbreak of World War I. It's unlikely many people in America, or even Australia for that matter, would have been too familiar with it back then. Most historians agree that in 1915, Gallipoli changed that forever.
I agree with the sentiment that Australia really began as a nation on the 25th of April, Anzac Day. I have no doubt in my mind that's the case.
For both Australia and the United States, the global conflict strengthened a sense of national identity, built around democratic freedoms.
Suddenly they were all thrown together on Gallipoli, and it's the same with the Americans. They were suddenly having to meet people from all over the 50 states and harmonise with them. So there was a kinship there. The fact that we were democracies, young-ish, Australia much younger than Federation 1901, but America was a new democracy, setting the trend for democracies worldwide.
For our ambassador to the United States, belief in democracy remains at the beating heart of our relationship with America today.
Australia is a great democracy. We've been continuously democratic from Federation and beyond. One of the few continuous democracies in the world. We have got to send a signal, an example to the rest of the world that we believe in those values. We don't accept the West is in decline, and we will stand up for those values. And if we stand up for them, we encourage freedom-loving people everywhere to stand up for them. And that's what the alliance is about.
On paper, the official alliance, as set out in the Anzac Treaty, only goes back as far as 1951. But Australia and the United States have cooperated as allies for much longer. It's an enduring alliance that goes back over 100 years.
And at the Battle of Hamel in 1918, Americans and Australians fighting under General Sir John Monash. The first time Americans were commanded by non-American officers. Bonds were forged on those battlefields, which have only grown with time. And this year we will celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Anzac Treaty.
To ensure that our American allies won't forget our historic contribution, Ambassador Sinodinos' predecessor in Washington, Joe Hockey, built a 100 Years of Mateship campaign.
This mateship, forged on a battlefield 100 years ago, has built an unbreakable foundation. On that foundation, we will build the bond of friendship for the next 100 years. We are mates.
Can you tell us why you started that campaign and what you think it's achieved?
Well, there were two things. One was President Obama remarked to a friend of mine that he didn't understand the term mateship and didn't know whether to use it in relation to Australians. And the second was that when Donald Trump was elected, he didn't come with any great knowledge of the relationship between Australia and the United States. We took for granted that America knew how significant we had been as part of the American story over the last 100 years. And so we just set about reminding Americans of what we meant for the United States.
His starting point? John Monash and the Battle of Hamel. An Australian general, Monash would use American soldiers to help break open the Western Front. The famous victory at Hamel was achieved in just 93 minutes.
There was only 1,000 at Hamel, but Monash said, I want your best regiment. So he got the 131st, which was notably just about the best regiment the Americans had. That was planned by Monash to draw in the alliance with the Americans. There was only 1,000, and he had to fight for it. Pershing, the commander of all American forces, said, no, you're not having any troops. That would have been a big embarrassment for him to be the first commander of US troops to have a foreign general take over. Never happened before.
As it turned out, General Pershing was very upset. American general said, we're not serving under another commander. Our Americans only fight under American leadership. Now, the Americans rebelled. The American soldiers on the ground started peeling off their American uniforms, and they said they'd wear the Australian uniform because they were not about to abandon their buddies. As a result, Pershing gave in.
It's no coincidence that Monash decided to fight the battle on the 4th of July, Independence Day.
And in the back of his mind was this attitude, which he'd had since studying America and being there. He wanted a 100-year alliance with them. That was what he talked about. He talked about a century. So he's got this perspicacity, this vision. Very few people have it in life. Monash had a vision of where Australia would be in the next century, and he believed in the American alliance. Monash really was the instigator of the alliance with America.
More than a century later, and this vision of an enduring alliance has been realised. To commemorate the centenary of the Battle of Hamel, the United States Embassy in Canberra honoured the Monash family in a special ceremony marking the 100th anniversary. Sir John Monash's great-grandson, Michael Bennett, was there to represent the family.
The Americans are very good at remembering their history, perhaps sometimes better than we are in Australia. And I was really honoured to be presented with a flag that had flown that week over the United States Embassy, an American flag, of course, and the reverence for which they held that particular period in their history was very obvious.
These days, we often think of America as the senior partner in the alliance, but back in World War I, it was actually our diggers who were the veterans.
That gave them great experience because the Australians were very seasoned fighters by that stage. And they also made sure, he made sure that they felt that they were doing something special on their day, the 4th of July, and would take the spirit of the Australians and the Americans to try and win this battle, which was accomplished brilliantly.
It was a magnificent victory that arguably turned the whole of the Western Front campaign. And it was because Americans and Australians came together for the first time, and certainly not the last time, to fight for strong values and to defeat a common enemy. And the Australians, and as the Americans were called, the doughboys, They became mates and buddies.
Hamel would lead to even greater success for the Allies. A decisive victory for Monash at the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918 would ultimately change the course of the war.
That's the big one. That smashed the two German armies. The Germans all said, all the key people from Ludendorff down said that finished us, we couldn't win now.
For his outstanding achievement, Sir John Monash was knighted on the battlefield. There is no question that Monash was a visionary, not only in his efforts to unite Americans and Australians, but also in his approach to battle itself.
As a military commander, John Monash was someone who considered his troops. He was very focused on the minimum collateral damage, if you like.
This modern approach is recognised and valued by military commanders, even to this day.
What's interesting about Monash is he wasn't, one of the sort of butchers of the Western Front. He was the first modern general, brought this notion of combined arms, the science of war. He called it the orchestration of war.
I think he was hugely successful. The ability that he had to bring together new technologies, right? We have tanks, we have aircraft, we have machine guns, and he brings them all together. He integrates them into a single battle plan. He orchestrates the timing of that plan exactly. And that becomes the success of the Battle of Hamel, becomes the foundation for plans in the future that bring victory to the Allies on the Western Front.
His innovative approach even introduced the use of machine guns as an offensive weapon on the battlefield.
It's strange to look back at it now and think they were only used offensively. In other words, they'd sit in the trenches or in the hills, wherever they were. He goes on a training course with under-officers with the machine gun, takes it apart, because he was a hands-on engineer. For an intellectual, this is quite weird, that he could actually take the thing apart, put it back together, to see how it really worked, and then went through all the exercises and used the gun himself. Went back to the other four commanders, and they said, oh, we have to use the machine gun offensively for the first time. Take them forward, that means. When the soldiers are moving forward, the munitions and the machine guns carried forward. So this was a small point, but typical of him, typical of his planning.
Today's war planning for the Alliance partners pays homage to the victory at Hamel. Every 2 years, as part of the bilateral exercise Talisman Sabre, ex-Hamel is the name given to the Army component. It's a huge operation.
Get in the bunker!
Major General Gus McLaughlin ran the exercise control in 2017.
The Army piece of the exercise is called Hamel, so in deference to General Monash. The broader exercise is called Talisman Sabre. 30,000+ Australians and Americans. And interestingly, we've worked pretty hard to keep other guests out. Increasingly the Kiwis and occasionally the Japanese are invited, but it's a pretty special exercise relationship. And into our really unique training area up in Shoalwater Bay, one of the best military training areas in the world, the Americans bring their top-end warfighting capability. And usually there's an Australian formation that plays the enemy. Australia sets up the exercise conditions, and true to General Monash's the science of war. It's a great forum for innovation, command and control exchanges, and things that are done there with integrated technologies that are done amongst very few military partners in the world. And it's an enormous exercise, an amazing array of events, from sailors falling overboard, all the way through to amphibious landings and sort of everything in between. But the Americans regard it incredibly highly because A, they have a credible force to train with, a very capable Red Force or enemy force, and a partnership that means that they can do that in a completely open and trusting way.
And they really allow us to come together, learn from each other, see what the Australians can teach the Americans, what the Americans can teach the Australians, and we push each other. We push each other to higher levels of excellence so that in the eventuality that we ever do have to fight, we're going to do it well, and we're going to do it seamlessly.
The Monash military tradition lives on, as does his passion for what we've come to know as the Alliance. One of the aspects of his career that is perhaps less well known is his role as an engineer. Inspired by the bright lights of New York City, he even brought electrification to the state of Victoria.
By the time of the war, he'd had enough experience of the United States to appreciate just what an influence they would be in the world. He often corresponded with his uncle, Leo Monash, who lived in Minneapolis in Minnesota. And if you read his diaries about his impression of New York and the skyscrapers and the positivity of the people and the expectation that they could achieve anything they wanted to achieve, it's no wonder that he saw the power some years later during the war of the alliance with the Americans.
For Joe Hockey, more should be done to recognise Sir John Monash and his contribution to Australia and the alliance.
Well, John Monash is unquestionably one of the great Australians and certainly our most significant military leader. You know, we could have done even more to honour the legacy of John Monash. I'm with the late Tim Fisher and others believing he should be retrospectively appointed a Field Marshal, the highest rank we have. In America, in 1976, President Ford appointed George Washington to the equivalent of six-star general, saying no one should be higher in ranking than him, and General Pershing had been the only other six-star. So in Australia, why can't we honour our greatest general in the same way the United States has and many other nations?
Coming up, how World War II shaped the modern alliance. Plus, we ask what lessons we can learn from both world wars to avoid a catastrophe in the 21st century.
In 1939, Australia would once again find itself following Britain into war with Germany.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Australia is at war.
Following the Menzies announcement, our forces began preparing for action against Germany and Italy in the Middle East and Africa. At the same time, the Australian government was engaging in a diplomatic offensive in Washington to try and secure support for the Allies.
Before 1940, Australia had no diplomatic representation in Washington, but that would change with the appointment of Richard Casey as Minister to the United States.
Casey's mission was to persuade the American administration to join the war.
When Casey presented his credentials to President Roosevelt, the US leader was unmoved. The President told Casey that in its relations with Australia, the element of distance meant a declining interest on the part of the United States.
Casey went about marketing Australia to Americans and successfully secured Aussie animals for American zoos. He even tried persuading Walt Disney to use them in his films. More importantly, given the war effort, Darwin had been offered as a US Army Air Force staging post, well in advance of Pearl Harbor.
Despite FDR's reluctance to be drawn into another world war, the President had in fact already started preparing the US for military conflict.
That conflict would be realised on December the 7th, 1941, a date President Roosevelt said will live in infamy.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan. I ask Congress to declare a state of war between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Well, let's be frank. The United States only had limited interest in the Pacific until the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. That was a game changer. And the Americans, naturally enough, react very badly to any attack on their soil. And the fact that it occurred in the Pacific was unfortunate, but it was so important for Australia's fate. Because if the United States didn't enter into World War II at that point, there's a very real a real likelihood that Australia would have been invaded by the Japanese. There's almost no doubt about it. And so even though it was our reserve soldiers that turned back the advancing Japanese in Papua New Guinea, without American reinforcements and, of course, without the massive military-industrial complex of the United States, Asia would look very different today to what it would have been in 1945.
One of the major considerations of the president and his generals was whether to commit American resources to the defence of Australia.
World War II was a totally different situation in that Americans regarded Australia, they never said it, but it was the floating aircraft carrier for the fight against the enemy, the Japanese.
Early on in the war, when they were deciding whether to invest in defending Australia back in 1941, as things were unravelling into the beginning of 1942, there was a hard-nosed calculus worked out, and they figured that Australia is worth defending as a base. And it wasn't so much a sentimental thing.
In late 1941 and early 1942, as Japan stormed into the war and invaded New Guinea, most Australian troops were in action in the Middle East. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin made a decisive move to bring our troops back to the Pacific, where they would fight once again alongside our American allies.
Papua New Guinea was the classic connection there because the Americans had new troops being sent there, inexperienced troops. Australia had the warriors coming back from the Middle East and North Africa. These blokes had been in the front line against Italians and Germans at that point. They came back to fight in New Guinea, and people don't really ever really comprehend how many Japanese, there were 250,000 Japanese in New Guinea during the war. Now, not all at once, but they're travelling through, and it wasn't for rest and recreation. It was to fight and get control of New Guinea.
In 1942, the tally of Japanese victories seemed unending. Hong Kong, Malaya, Thailand, most of Burma, and the Philippines. 4 days after the fall of Singapore, the Japanese started bombing Darwin. The largest single attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australia.
We needed help at that time of the world too. Things were very bad. All down Guadalcanal, all that passage down. The Japs were everywhere, and our boys were there. That part of the world was in a real mess.
Marion Painter was a young woman in World War II and remembers the Americans entering the war after Pearl Harbor.
Well, in the beginning, to me, it was very worrying. I was very distressed that I felt everybody should be doing something, and my family weren't doing anything. My father had been at Gallipoli, and his only brother, and I'd lived on hearing about the First World War, and I just felt that everybody should be doing something because things were really very desperate.
To do her bit, Marion would join the Australian Women's Army Service and remembers the impact the Americans would have on the war, not least when it came to supplies. Led by American General Douglas MacArthur, the commander kept his soldiers well supplied with everything from sliced bread to Coca-Cola.
When I first tasted Coca-Cola, I thought it was poison. I thought, oh, how could you drink this? I like it now, but I didn't then. But he bought all sorts of things that were typically American. Pumpkin pie, beautiful. I'd never heard of it.
The provisions meant the Americans were very popular down under, with the women at least.
We'd go into Melbourne for the day off and you'd see all these gorgeous-looking Yanks with their pockets full of money, with a girl on each arm, not army, nice civilian girls. And I'd think, oh, half your luck, you know. It never happened to us. And all the girls that had boyfriends that were Yanks were very nicely clad in the very latest of everything. And they were real sheiks, they really were. The Australian boys, I think, resented the fact that they didn't get much money in their army pay. The Yanks did. They always seemed to have a lot of leave, which our boys didn't seem to have. But I know the boys in my unit were not great lovers of them because they thought they were able to, spoil the girls where I think they got 6 shillings a day or something.
In Queensland, the resentment would spill into an out-and-out brawl. The Battle of Brisbane made the fallout between the Allies famous. It wouldn't last.
Once the boys got to know each other, they became great friends too. But they did resent that they had so much and we all seemed to have so little.
In her role in the Australian Special Wireless Group, Marion didn't have much time for the Yanks.
We never got the chance much to go out with them because we were so busy learning what we had to learn. And I was intent on winning the war in my mind at that stage. I really thought I'm here for a purpose and I've got to find something that will make a difference. Little did I know that 60 years later, in a letter, I was going to be told that had happened.
Marion's unit had helped crack a Japanese code for which she would later be awarded a medal.
But this one I treasure very much because that's the one that made the difference. 60 years after the war, and I was living here in Warvets, I had a letter from the Prime Minister of England saying, and with it came this beautiful medal that I treasure, which on the back says, "We also served." And he said that as an outpost to Bletchley Park, the work that our unit did was invaluable and had shortened the war in the Pacific by perhaps 2 years.
Marion's work was typical of Australia's service during World War II.
And the work they did had a transformative effect in terms of the ability of the Allies to push back, to turn the tide on the Japanese, both in the Battle of the Coral Sea in April 1942 and then the following month in the Battle of Midway in May 1942. When code breaking, a lot of it actually undertaken in Melbourne, in Australia, was instrumental in piecing together the jigsaw to show exactly what the Japanese planned and then how the Allies could respond and effectively conduct a counter-ambush. Transformed the battles, transformed the power equation in the Western Pacific and set us up collectively for success in the Second World War.
The Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway are seen as decisive victories for the Allies in the fight against Japan. It also helped forge the strategic alliance between Australia and the United States.
And there's a little bit of rub point over how much credit Australia was getting for the work that they were doing. For instance, in the movie, the Battle of the Midway movie that came out a couple of years ago, talks about the significance of signals intelligence in enabling the US Navy to position itself and get inside the decision cycle of the Japanese Imperial Navy. But it doesn't acknowledge the role of the Aussies in Melbourne, who are critical to make that happen. Now, that's an understandable Hollywood slip, if you like.
Well, there's no doubt that Australia was completely committed to the war in the Pacific. Being threatened in its homeland for the first time with the threat of invasion, we look at the fact that, of 7 million people, 1/7 of the total population was committed to the war effort. Not just the troops abroad, which fought brilliantly and against entrenched defensive Japanese positions, but on the home front as well. So the whole of Australia came together and provided supplies, provided food, not just for their own troops, but really for the majority of US forces in the Pacific. And that, not just the food, not just the supplies, but then opening up the country and allowing staging areas, training areas, logistics areas that really provided everything we needed in order to push that war effort towards Japan.
A former ambassador to the United States, WA Governor Kim Beazley sees the intense collaboration between Australia and the United States as the true origin of the alliance as we know it today.
World War II was really the beginning of that adjacency. But, as we do now, we delivered. So, MacArthur, until 1944, had more Australian service personnel under his command than American, point one. And point two, we have a unique distinction. We are the only nation where, on Lend-Lease programs, the Americans ended up as a debtor. So we forgave them that debt at the end of the war. I doubt whether they forgave anyone else.
It's very hard for a lot of Australians even to think back to the threat that Australia may have faced. But being a Sydney-sider, Sydney faced attack, albeit on a relatively small scale, from submarines that penetrated Sydney Harbour. But had it not been for the stopping of the Japanese carrier fleets around Midway, Australia may genuinely have been under significant military threat. We put a lot of focus on the birth of our military tradition at Gallipoli, but arguably the birth of our military tradition, modern military tradition, is really the Kokoda Track, where had those ragtag militia soldiers not stopped the Japanese on the approaches to Northern Australia and the Midway campaign and the following actions of Australian soldiers and US soldiers to push the Japanese out of Papua New Guinea, it might have been a very different war. So that is a period of really significant strategic pivot, and I guess it signalled the change of our strategic alliance for away from the United Kingdom as our partner and the emergence of the US as our strategic partner.
Coming up, what lessons can the alliance partners learn from history to avoid the catastrophic consequences of another major conflict?
I think the biggest danger in the world at the moment is a superpower competition spiralling out of control.
The words "lest we forget" are chiselled into our nation's consciousness. They're important because not only do they serve as a tribute to our fallen, they serve as a reminder to today's leaders that there is a very real cost of war, and where possible, we must strive to avoid conflict on such an unimaginable scale happening again. In his role as the most senior American official here in Australia, Acting US Ambassador and Charge d'Affaires Mike Goldman attended the national service in Canberra.
Those who have served our nation have bequeathed to us a great legacy. May we, and the generations that come, prove worthy of their sacrifice.
You were at the memorial for Anzac Day for those services. As an ally, how do you reflect on the importance of Anzac Day and how it resonates in this country and across the ditch?
Well, I'm deeply impressed. I've been at Anzac Day, the Dawn commemorations, both here in Australia, but also in Commonwealth countries. My last posting was in Fiji, and they have a smaller scale but equally moving, reverent dawn ceremony in Fiji, and that's really touching. It reminds us both of the costs of war and the importance of sharing common ground and standing shoulder to shoulder. So I find it incredibly poignant. It also gives me great confidence when I see young people, young school kids participating in the commemorations, that ANZUS will be vital and consequential for generations to come in addition.
How significant is it that we have fought side by side in every major conflict of the last century?
I think it's hugely significant because, there's no better measure, there's no stronger measure of our commitment to each other than the fact that we've made the ultimate sacrifice.
So when you look back at history and the build-up to World War I, World War II, what lessons can we learn to avoid catastrophic circumstances like that again?
That's a terrific question. So there's a, I think it was Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And if it's not Mark Twain, it ought to be Mark Twain. In any case, the lessons of World War I and World War II are profound. But they offer different lessons. World War I teaches us the dangers of escalation and the very real costs of war. And I think there's no more significant, poignant reminder of that than the architecture of Canberra. You have the new Parliament building overlooking the old Parliament building, looking directly at the war memorial. And I think that that was purpose-built to remind us of the costs of war. The lessons from World War II are that democracies need to stand stalwart, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in the face of tyranny, in the face of threats to things that we hold dear. And I think in both conflicts, the United States and Australia did stand together, and I'm confident that we'll stand together, cognizant of these lessons as we face challenges in the future.
When it comes to the nature of the challenges that lie ahead, the Biden administration has made its position quite clear.
President Biden's Director of Intelligence describes China's push for global power as the biggest threat facing the world today. How big is that threat in your view?
Oh, I think it's real, it's significant, it's the taken together, it's the dominant challenge of the next several decades. I mean, that said, I have every confidence that it's a challenge that we'll be able to meet together with our allies. I think Secretary Blinken put it well when he said, we'll cooperate with China in areas where it's possible, we'll compete with China in areas where it's necessary, and we'll have an adversarial relationship where we have no choice. He put it better than that, but that's the essence of it.
In Washington, Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher, who co-chairs the Friends of Australia caucus, is less diplomatic.
I think it's the most serious challenge facing the world today. I think we're waking up, in part due to Australia's experience, in part due to the economic coercion we've seen the Chinese Communist Party wield against Australia when your government had the temerity to suggest we needed an investigation into the origins of coronavirus. And that's been a wake-up for the whole world. And now it's time for the free world to band together and figure out how we're going to defend basic Western values. So I think this will be the challenge of our lifetime. And again, I think we're at the front end, not the back end.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Last month, our Foreign Minister Marise Payne held a joint press conference in Washington with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. The message to Beijing was simple.
The United States will not leave Australia alone on the field, or maybe I should say alone on the pitch, in the face of economic coercion by China. That's what allies do. We have each other's backs, so we can face threats and challenges from a position of collective strength.
We've had very good engagement with the United States, and certainly my visit to Washington last month also with a full opportunity right across the administration to engage on these key issues has really reinforced those shared interests. What the United States has indicated is their strong commitment to engage and to advocate on the important values that bring us to the table together, the indispensable alliance between the US and Australia. We've heard very strong messages from the US, and we certainly welcome those.
I think the new administration has had a major impact. In terms of the alliance, I think what is different is that the administration's been a lot more forthcoming about the focus it puts on allies and partners. They see it as one of the great advantages that the US has, this network of alliances and partners. And so that's an important thing, which is not just in the rhetoric, but in the practice. And what I mean by that is in the run-up, for example, to the discussions between the Americans and the Chinese, there was a lot of groundwork done with allies and partners, with us, with Japan and with Korea, for example. The first foreign trips by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defence were to Japan and Korea. And that was all laying the groundwork. And then, of course, having the Quad meeting occur between Australia, Japan, India and the US at the leaders level.
One of the first things Biden did as president was open up a dialogue with the so-called Quad group of nations to help maintain a rules-based international order.
President Biden, Prime Minister Morrison and Prime Minister Suga. It is good to be among the friends.
Is that an attempt to contain China?
No, I'd say it's not. It's not a sort of NATO for East Asia. Let me tell you what I love about the Quad. It's difficult to envision four countries that are fundamentally as different as the constituent members of the Quad. You know, different in terms of their geography, in terms of their demography, in terms of their economic disposition. They're very different societies, and yet they're bound by a common reverence for democratic principles and the rule of law.
If it's not an attempt to contain, does it balance China?
I mean, I think international politics is all about finding the proper balance. So in that sense, sure, but it's not a formal alliance in the way that NATO is. It's not set out to counter China. To the extent that China is willing to participate in these endeavors, sure, we would welcome China as a partner in fostering a rules-based international order. To the extent that they stand in the way of a rules-based international order, then it's incumbent on democracies and like-minded countries to sort of get on with it and show that democracy can deliver to our peoples and to the international community.
The Biden administration's approach has been welcomed by both Democrats and Republicans.
Well, I think it's probably our best tool in the competition with China. There simply is no winning that competition without drawing closer to longstanding allies like Australia and Japan, as well as non-aligned partners such as India. India in particular, I think, is a very important piece of the puzzle. And the fact is we have a lot of common interests that we could expand upon. Energy cooperation, for example, I think is an area where we've only begun to scratch the surface. I think the incoming administration was smart to prioritize the Quad meeting prior to their Alaska summit with the CCP. I sort of view Five Eyes and the Quad as the foundations for any successful allied effort to push back against growing CCP aggression.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the Quad has re-emerged as a way of offsetting some of the more aggressive behaviour by China. Japan, the United States, India and Australia have all been on the receiving end of some degree of aggression from China. And, of course, if they all come together to defend themselves and defend their interests, our friends in China shouldn't be surprised.
Despite the growing concerns that there are echoes of the 20th century sounding in today's foreign policy, there are significant differences.
So there's a key difference between the balance of power in 1914 and the emerging balance of power in 2021. There is no mutual defence clause to the Quad Security Initiative. What there is a recognition of the utility to consult and to coordinate and collaborate and to build relationships and trust and confidence and a degree of interoperability so that in a crisis they can, should they so choose, collaborate with each other with a level of confidence in understanding how each other works and how each other can collaborate with each other to their mutual benefit.
Navigating a course of action and finding the right balance ultimately comes down to the strength and nerve of the leadership coming from the White House here behind me. For former Defence Minister Christopher Pyne, the stakes couldn't be higher.
I think the biggest danger in the world at the moment is a superpower competition spiralling out of control. And the most important thing that we can do is make sure that doesn't happen. It's happened before in world history. And it's very important, and President Biden is right to highlight multinationalism and bilateral relationships like the one with the US and the strengthening of alliances. And it's no surprise in his first strategic memorandum or document that he announced the direction of US policy in his White House, he had as preeminent the relationships that the US has with its traditional allies, and Australia was the first country mentioned. This is not coincidental.
For Pyne, Taiwan is the biggest concern.
We should be very worried about Taiwan for the reason being that if our policies and our actions towards China are not very clear about our support for Taiwan having a peaceful future as opposed to a forced reintegration into the mainland, that there will be consequences for that. And we don't know what how far those consequences will reach. Taiwan is a real flashpoint. I think The Economist magazine just recently described it as the most dangerous place on the earth. That's something I think I wrote about a year ago. When I first gave my speech at the Adelaide University graduation ceremony, some commentators said that I was unnecessarily creating stress about the relationship with China. It's perhaps best if we didn't talk about it. Actually, the most important thing we can do is talk about it, because the Australian public need to know that these are the very serious challenges that we face, which could potentially be an existential threat. And so that the most important foreign and defence policy that we can adopt is to avoid war over Taiwan. But the most important way for China to avoid a war over Taiwan is to understand what the consequences of trying to have a forced integration with Taiwan would be. And I think, as I think I said in my speech in various columns, a Biden presidency makes war less likely than a continuing Trump presidency would have.
Is there any sense that the ANZUS Treaty could be used by the US, say, to ask Australia to support the US in any kind of direct confrontation?
It wouldn't be a direct attack on the United States or Australia, but or New Zealand. But look, no one wins out of war, and certainly if there were an attack on Taiwan, it would be a devastating threat to the stability of the Indo-Pacific region. And I have no doubt that the United States would react very aggressively, and they would expect others to join in.
The real question from a military perspective is, could we do it?
The emergence of Chinese, what's called anti-access and area denial capability, meaning long-range, accurate, sometimes steerable missiles and sensors that can push approaching surface combatants like aircraft carriers a lot further away than has ever been the case before, makes the Taiwan situation now militarily challenging in a way that perhaps for the last couple of decades it wouldn't have been for a superpower like the United States. I think it's fair to say Australia has only probably 3 ships, the new air warfare destroyers, or 3 surface ships, the new air warfare destroyers that could even approach that kind of environment with any ability to defend themselves. It also explains why our submarines are such an important capability, and the level of government investment and again, some considerable controversy over the choice of our future submarine. But again, it's one of the few capabilities capable of contributing to that scenario. Now, I am not one who thinks a conflict is imminent, but competition is underway as we speak, and so the situation in the South China Sea, these reefs in the South China Sea, the expansion of Chinese influence, all of those mean competition has started. You might hear defence analysts talking about grey zone or hybrid conflict, meaning a level of competition bordering on conflict just below the detection threshold of war, if you like. So the days of blue on one side of the map, red on the other, and approaching each other in an open, transparent way, much more complex set of circumstances for defence planners now. My message would be, we've got to be strong, capable, we've got to be assertive, we've got to invest in capability and maintain our partnerships, not just with the Americans, but with our Pacific and Southeast Asian partners. But let's be careful about talking about war as if it's somehow manageable or containable.
How well prepared is the United States, and Australia for that matter, in the event that that were to result in conflict, for example?
Yeah, so I think we are quite well prepared. I'd like to emphasize that, sort of contrary to what you hear often, it's been a remarkable success, U.S.-Taiwan policy and the Taiwan policy pursued by Australia and our like-minded allies. We've avoided military conflict across the Taiwan Strait for decades, and in that space, Taiwan has flourished as a democracy and a forward-leaning capitalist economy. The Taiwan Relation Act obliges us to meet and support the legitimate self-defense needs of Taiwan, and we're committed to that going forward.
Taiwan is the first island in the island chain. If things were to get worse, can we rely on the United States?
So going back to where we were in terms of the treaty and what's written in it, if Australia were attacked, can we count on the United States to help us defend our sovereignty?
I think absolutely you can. We have your back, absolutely, just as you had our back 20 years ago in 2001 after 9/11. You know, it was the one time ANZUS has been formally invoked, and I think that was deeply resonant and consequential, and I think you can absolutely depend on the United States.
Under Donald Trump, it was all about America first, and sometimes that meant America alone. Joe Biden is a traditionalist. He supports alliances like ours, and that's good news for Australia, particularly when it comes to China. And it makes the alliance as crucial as ever. In episode 2, we go back to the signing of the ANZUS Treaty and assess how the Cold War shaped warmer relations between the alliance partners. We also look at how education and innovation partnerships brought our nations closer together. That's all to come on The Alliance.